everyone. My name is Gönül Tol. I'm the director of Middle East Institute's Turkey program and a senior fellow of the Frontier Europe initiative. I welcome you all to today's webinar, which is co-sponsored by the Atlantic Council, America's Future in the Black Sea region. We recently published a report for those who haven't seen it yet. The title is Election 2020, The Future of US Black Sea Relations. It was co-authored by 7 leading experts in the Black Sea security, and it delves into the key issues and policy recommendations for the new US administration to consider in its approach to the region. And it features also perspectives from the region to explore key areas of potential partnership. And as some of you might be following, the US elections coincided with elections in several Black Sea countries, and there's much at stake when looking forward to shifting political, economic, and security dynamics. I'm very pleased to introduce a wonderful panel of experts to discuss these findings in our report. You can find a link to the report in the Zoom chat box. First, I would like to welcome Dimitar Beshe. Dimitar is a senior fellow with us with the Frontier Europe initiative at MEI, as well as a senior fellow with the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Melinda Hiring. She is the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, and she's also a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And finally, we have my colleague Yulia. She is also a senior fellow with MEI's Frontier Europe initiative. She is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Thank you so much. Welcome. I look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all find on your screens. And also for those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live screen, you can ask a question by emailing events.mei.edu. And please feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I will be looking at all of your questions and will factor as many as possible into the discussion. Well, first, thanks to our panelists. Yulia, let me start with you. Here in Washington, compared to other hotspots in the world, we don't pay much attention to the Black Sea. So tell us why that's wrong and why Black Sea is important for US interests.
So hi, everyone. Thank you, Gönül, for your question. Before we delve into speculations on how a Biden administration's Black Sea policy will look like, as I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions on that, I'd like to take a moment to look at the last weeks of the US election campaign and what was at stake for the Black Sea as a region. Our report that Gönül mentioned on US elections in the Black Sea offers insights into how differently US elections were viewed from Black Sea capitals. And you can see from Ankara's strained relationship, with Washington, through Moscow's kind of mocking of the elections, through the complicated cases like Ukraine and Moldova, each one with their specific bilateral issues with regards to the United States, all the way to America's key strategic allies in the region, Georgia and Romania, that they've been very different in what their expectations have been on US elections and what has been at stake for them. They can hardly be compared, as we've seen in the report that we've issued, and it's difficult to identify shared concerns among Black Sea countries with regards to the United States. For each of the Black Sea countries, US elections have meant basically something else. If we are but to look at the American side, Trump's term has actually meant a stepped up engagement in the Black Sea when it comes to Western security. For instance, the European Deterrence Initiative reached under the Trump mandate $6.5 billion, some of which has been directed into Georgia, into Ukraine, into Romania's and Bulgaria's as member states, NATO member states deterrence. The other thing that I would say has left a deep mark on Black Sea security has been Trump's great power competition policy with regard specifically to the Black Sea region, which was translated particularly over the last few months into multi-billion bilateral deals the United States has made in the region to increase energy security and to, at the same time, contain Russia and China in the region. And I'm happy to go into that in details a bit later on. But as we still see today, even as we speak, in the last 100 days of the Trump administration, a US interest and presence in the region is still active and increased, something that is rather rare for the Black Sea shores, that we see American presence and interest so heavily. In a few days, just as an example, Pompeo, US Secretary Pompeo, will travel to Tbilisi to discuss strategic bilateral cooperation, and he'll probably want to make a deal that can go through as his grand finale of great power competition policy in the Black Sea. And then on the other hand, we have now a Biden administration for the next term.
Well, we'll go into that later. I just wanted to our viewers to get a sense of what US interests there are and what has been the US policy vis-a-vis the Black Sea so far. So Dimitar, I want to go to you next. What are, you cover Bulgaria, what are some of the issues that have historically shaped Bulgaria's relationship with the United States?
Well, there's this one word that matters, and that's called Russia. Bulgaria is one of those countries in NATO which probably resemble the post-Soviet bunch most closely, in the sense that many of the governance issues that enable Russia to wield disproportionate influence have been present in the country, from the economy to media, to corruption and state capture. If you look at Bulgarian foreign policy, just to take a step back, it's always been risk averse, trying to please all the potential power holders in the region. Of course, first and foremost, the United States. Just to bring the clock back, in November last year, we saw the Bulgarian Prime Minister being welcomed in the White House by Trump himself, and they struck good rapport, not least because Bulgaria endorsed a big military procurement deal to modernize its air force. That was music to the ears of Trump. So there's this agenda of strengthening the relationship with the US, and that won't change with Biden. I expect more of that. Having said that, the big item in Bulgaria these days is just the government rushing to complete Turk Stream 2. As per the TASS news agency in Moscow, work is complete. So as you cooperate with the United States, there's a fair amount of work being done with the Russians as well. And also, to kick the ball back to your court, Gönül, Turkey is really important. Within the EU, Bulgaria is one of those member states making a consistent argument for engagement with Turkey, for the simple reason Turkey is a big neighbor and also a big export market for Bulgaria. So it's a balancing act, and it takes a lot of skill to carry it out. And I don't see how Biden will change that, except that maybe there'll be more of those military deals and hopefully energy, but I'll come back to that later.
Yeah, no, you mentioned, Dimitar, and that was going to be my second question. You mentioned how Bulgaria is trying to please all stakeholders. It is a country which tries to pursue a balanced relationship with the West and Russia. So I wanted to ask you, can you tell us a bit more about what that means in practice?
Well, just to bring a very vivid example, everybody knows about the Salisbury attack, right? The Skripals. Well, guess what? We now know that the team with GRU involved in carrying out those operations was also employed in Bulgaria 3 years beforehand, in 2015, targeting a Bulgarian arms dealer who, by the way, was selling weapons to the Georgians. Now, we don't know what was the business dispute and why the Russians got involved, but we do know, courtesy of the Brits and also the Americans, that it was the same outfit, the same unit. The Bulgarian prosecution service dragged their feet for years on end out of fear to antagonize Moscow, but they came under sustained pressure from the West. And lately, in the past year, you saw something that was unprecedented. Russian diplomats being declared persona non grata, some indictments being brought forward, and so on and so forth. So what just a few years ago was a subject area of whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and civic activists now has become central to Bulgarian-US relations, and Bulgaria has tried to strengthen relations with the West on that front. And this is really essential because soft security and rule of law is a critical area. And I hope we'll be discussing that as well, not just matters of military security.
Well, just you mentioned Turkey. Just like Bulgaria, Turkey is in a difficult spot between its West alliance with the West and the increasingly closer cooperation that it has been cultivating with Russia. And the relationship, the strain, the problems facing Turkey-US relations has its roots, maybe if you look back a few years, it started under the Obama administration. So by the time US elections were held in November 2016, Turkey-US relationship had already been rocked by serious disagreements. So for Erdogan, after a promising start, the Obama administration ended up being a huge disappointment. So Donald Trump's election, therefore, was welcome news in Ankara, and Erdogan hoped to turn a new page in relations with the US because of what was happening, the Obama administration's decision to work with the YPG and several regional affairs. It's just, and then the failed coup in Turkey, those things poisoned Turkey-US relations. So President Erdogan certainly hoped to turn a new page in Turkey's relationship with the United States, and he had the utmost faith in his friend in the White House. And 4 years on, Trump has proven himself actually worthy of Erdogan's trust. At a time when Obama-era problems continue to haunt Turkey-US relations, which has caused unprecedented frustration in Congress, at the Pentagon and in the State Department, Trump still considers Erdogan a very good friend. And he has gone the extra mile to shield Erdogan from congressional sanctions over Turkey's purchase of Russian S-400s and derail the Halkbank indictment. And Trump's announcement of the US withdrawal from Syria was, again, welcome news in Ankara, which hope that this would solve its Kurdish problem. But it's still a mixed bag if you look at the Trump legacy in Turkey-US relations, because despite his best intentions, obviously he could not fix the most critical problems in Turkey-US ties and made some of them worse, I would say. Fethullah Gülen, the Islamic cleric who has been living in Pennsylvania since the 1990s, and the Turkish government has been accusing him of orchestrating the failed coup. He's still in the US. Halkbank, which is a Turkish state-owned bank that was accused of creating being part of a scheme to sideline the Iran sanctions, it's been indicted, and this has happened under Trump's watch. And Congress is I think more determined than ever to punish Erdogan over the S-400 issue. And there's still a few hundred American troops remaining in Syria, but the US still considers the Kurdish militia a key US ally. And at times, Trump has even created new problems for Erdogan. Some of you might remember Trump slapped sanctions on Turkey to secure the release of Pastor Brunson in 2018. 2018, which prompted a sharp decline in Turkish currency to a record low. And he did it again in 2019 when he announced sanctions to prevent a Turkish assault against the Kurdish fighters and civilians in Syria. So Trump's legacy in terms of Turkey-U.S. relations is a mixed bag. And I want to turn to Melinda now. Ukraine has been part of American domestic politics, thanks to President Trump recently. But in fact, Ukraine has always been a key part of U.S. policy discussions. The U.S. has always wanted to keep Ukraine in Washington's fold. So please tell us why, so our viewers get a sense of the background to U.S.-Ukraine relations.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you all. I really admire the work that MEI is doing on the Black Sea. So the U.S.-Ukrainian relationship got very, very complicated last year. And unfortunately, Ukraine was drawn in, and it didn't want to be there. It was a really weird year for Ukraine to be drawn in. They had a brand new president, a brand new parliament that was dominated by someone who had no political experience. So it was a tough year for Ukraine if you look at it from a domestic perspective. Stepping back, though, the U.S.-Ukrainian relationship is very strong. It has been strong for years. Support remains very strong across the aisle on Capitol Hill. And that was sort of the saving grace of the Trump administration. So in spite of the things that Donald Trump said, in spite of Ukraine being drawn into that impeachment fight, there was strong bipartisan support on Capitol Hill, and the assistance dollars continued to flow. And also, we need to give a huge shout out to the civil servants at the State Department. There's incredible knowledge, incredible expertise on Ukraine, and they really held the line. But I should give Donald Trump credit for one thing. He made the right decision on javelins. Unlike Obama, his predecessor, Obama didn't want to send javelins. He was very, very concerned about escalation dominance. I think he was misguided. You know, he's a very cautious person. And Trump, for reasons that were probably not very admirable, said, well, Obama didn't do it, I'm going to do it. Laying aside those motives, it was the right call. It gave Ukraine a lot of security guarantees, and it sent the signal that America had its back. So, last year was an ugly year, just to summarize, was an ugly year in U.S.-Ukrainian relations. And I think everyone wants to move on. And everyone in Kiev is extremely happy at the outcome. And I don't think it's going to be as good for Kiev as they think it's going to be. But let's get into that in a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I actually want to turn to the outcome of U.S. elections and how that's seen by regional countries. So, Yulia, back to you. You also cover Romania, Georgia, and Moldova too. So it's been Romania has been a loyal U.S. ally. The country is threatened by Russia in the Black Sea, but the U.S. has not paid enough attention to Romania. First, tell us what Trump policy has been vis-a-vis Romania, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Gunnar. I think with the risk of overgeneralizing, we have actually in the complex environment, whether we can call it a region cohesiveness or not, in the Black Sea, we have two very different actors with the very same policy. One is Romania, that has been a NATO and EU member state, and the other one is Georgia, that is not a NATO and EU member state. But both of them have seen US elections kind of in the same vein. And I would say there's two things to that. One thing is, no matter who is president, from Bucharest or Tbilisi's view in the United States, the most important security guarantee for them is the United States. So they rely on Washington's support and continuous support throughout administrations. Now, the second point, if we are to drill down a bit deeper, is that overall in the Western-oriented countries in the Black Sea, you do see a tendency, not a generalized tendency, but a tendency to support rather the Republican Party than the Democratic Party, for the simple reason that traditionally, basically since Reagan time, so before the end of the Cold War, Republicans have been perceived as more active in the region because they share a heightened threat perception of Russia, just like the Western-oriented Black Sea countries like Romania do. So if we are to look at the last two presidents in the United States, Obama has been perceived as a lukewarm response to what has happened. Even Bush has been perceived as a lukewarm response to 2008 Russo-Georgian war. And the Trump administration, though partially unexpected, has really, maybe for the wrong reasons, but has on the ground ramped up its support significantly. And you can see that with money, and you can see that with political support, and you can see that with economic deals that have been missing in the region, because critical infrastructure is such a vital issue that is underdeveloped in the Black Sea, and that leads, obviously, more development leads to more democratization. So actually, what I was alluding to initially with the Pompeo visit to Tbilisi, that has been the thing that that Bucharest and others have supported in the region, that we've seen in the bilateral relationship between the United States and Romania, the biggest economic deal in their history, $8 billion last month for the development of the further development of Romania's nuclear power plants that has been basically snatched away from the Chinese that had already been investing in that. We've seen it then beyond that with a memorandum of understanding, not so clear in Bulgaria. Dimitar can tell you more about that. And we've seen it more north in Poland, and we might see something similar in Georgia next week. So in this light, Pompeo, with a push for great power competition, leaning first into the Black Sea in the first few years, and basically vetoing out across the region in Ukraine, in Romania, in Georgia, and in others, China's presence, and indirectly also Russia's encroachment into the region, has been, in the last few months, actually come hand in hand with real economic deals that make a difference. So for the Biden administration that comes next, in the perspective of Bucharest policymakers and other Western-oriented countries in the Black Sea region, Biden's administration has a lot to weigh in on, and they're waiting to see if the new administration will continue a more aggressive and a more increased presence in the region, or whether Biden's Black Sea policy will mean something else for the Black Sea region: less military support, less political heavy support for the fight against Russian and Chinese influence, and more focused on anti-corruption and other issues. So that's kind of how Romania specifically, but also Georgia to a certain extent, looks at it.
Well, how do you look at it? Do you expect a change in policy under a Biden administration, given there's the assumption that he's going to be tougher on Russia? So how is that going to impact Biden administration's policy? And please, anyone, feel free to jump in.
Sure, I'll just very quickly run through a couple of points, and then maybe Melinda and Dimitar want to nuance it. But I would say that the Biden administration, well, Biden as a president is the most transatlantic president that the US has seen in many years, maybe even since Clinton. So obviously expectations are high, but then Biden is seen as a Democratic president, less of a heavy hand on Russia in terms of military involvement, and maybe more on the soft power. So that's one of the things that that I see as something still unclear. I think we can be optimistic that Biden will lean into the region, but we have to see through which instruments. And then Biden's administration, in my opinion, will have to have a lot to deal with in the region, because compared to just 1 year ago, where already the Black Sea has been for many years one of the most volatile security environments in the world, and particularly in Europe's neighborhood, we now have increased insecurity. We see the Nagorno-Karabakh ceasefire, where the West, both the United States and Europe, have both looked from the outside and have not been involved in actual border changes, which put Russian peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh, which heavily increases regional insecurity, particularly in the South Caucasus. But these tendencies, these issues have a tendency to spread around the Black Sea, as it's a small region. And then maybe one of the important things that the region is looking at, in my view, when it comes to the Biden administration is, so first, Russia, to what extent will he step up and in what shape he will step up his administration, but also China. China has been, before great power competition, Trump administration, a non-actor in the Black Sea, at least perceived from Black Sea countries. The Trump administration has been heavily pushing on that, to the extent that sometimes Black Sea people in Romania and other places have been frowning and saying, where does China come from now? The Trump administration has managed to heavily put that on the agenda of the Black Sea. And I think it's implicit when we look at US foreign policy that a continued great power competition will take place in the Biden administration. But his instruments, Biden administration's instruments on China, might differ very much in terms of policy outcomes on the ground, particularly when it comes to the Black Sea region. So these three things, I think, are what I am looking at in terms of the future Biden administration, how transatlantic and in what shape, great power competition with China is taking place, and finally, whether the United States and the West overall will actually continue to stay away from the South Caucasus as things are unfolding there out of their control, out of the Western's control, or will actually step in. And I'm rather pessimistic about the last one.
Well, Dimitar, let me turn to you next. How, and I'll ask this question to Melinda as well. How is Trump's, this is something that I'm personally curious about, but there's also a bigger debate too, but how is Trump's brand of right-wing populism viewed in Bulgaria?
Well, if Trump was to run in Bulgaria, he would win in a landslide. At least that's my non-representative sample of looking at comments on the internet. People, the kind of message that comes from Trump resonates. And you shouldn't be surprised, because if the West discovered populism lately, populism has been the name of the game in Bulgaria. I mean, mind you, we're governed by a prime minister who built his career being a tough guy, arresting criminals, from a security firm to the head of police to mayor of Sofia. So he's the quintessential populist leader, even if he doesn't have populist policies, but they have somebody. And I hasten to add that in terms of political survival skills, he is way ahead of Trump. It's just that he happens to be born not in Queens, New York, but in another place. But the kind of Trump messaging strikes a chord in Bulgaria, and I suspect some of the talking points are amplified by a Russian or Russian-friendly disinformation networks. I mean, if you talk to the average person, they, I think, are convinced that Joe Biden is on his deathbed, that he's dysfunctional, cannot put together a sentence, and so on and so forth. But the populist message that the game has been rigged, that neoliberalism has upended people's livelihoods, that migrants coming from the Middle East are the ultimate threat, LGBT rights, the whole package coming from the West has been under fire in Bulgaria. So, I mean, Trumpism has great purchase in those places where democracy is feeble, rule of law is not embedded. but also the information space is really polluted and media have deteriorated. If you look at Bulgaria over the past 10, 15 years, it has declined sharply in Reporters Without Borders, which leads me to a final remark. There's a silver lining, and that's a story that hasn't been reported that much. Radio Free Europe has returned in this part of the world, in Romania, in Bulgaria, and also now in Hungary. And let me tell you, in the Bulgarian case, it has made a difference right away, breaking out some corruption stories. So at least going back to the US, there's this branch of American policy encouraging free media and investigative journalism that makes a huge difference.
Thanks, Dimitar. Melinda, again, I want to ask you the same question, but before that, let me ask you this. How do Ukrainian officials feel about the outcome of US elections?
In a word, relieved. Look, it's obvious to anyone who's been paying attention for the last year that Biden is a much better choice for Ukraine. I can make an argument that things would have been okay under Trump because of Congress, because of the diaspora, because of a strong advocacy push in Washington, but it's frankly much, much better with Biden. Biden knows the elite, he knows the country, he cares about it. He understands that Ukraine is on the front line of freedom in Europe, in Eastern Europe. We have to hold the Russians back or it's going to get a lot worse for the region. He gets that. He's personally committed to it. His staff is excellent. I expect Dr. Michael Carpenter to have a big role and hopefully to run the Russia and Ukraine portfolio. He knows everyone there. He knows their games, and he's going to call them on the carpet. So I think Kiev is relieved, but I don't think they understand that the Biden administration is not going to give them a free pass. In the past, the U.S. has given, in my view, has been too easy on Ukraine. They've been too forgiving. They've said, "Oh, you're under Russian attack. We're going to look past your other shortcomings." The Biden administration is going to be tough on anti-corruption, and there's a huge problem in Ukraine right now.
Melinda, sorry to interrupt, but you and Yulia were talking about this, but someone from the Biden administration made a statement, right, about Ukraine, about how Russia is less of a threat than the ongoing corruption in the country. So that's very telling.
Biden has been very eloquent that corruption is eating at the country. He knows that, he understands that. Now, your other question about populism with Trump is not a popular figure there, but Zelensky, the president, is a populist. I mean, they're quite different, and I don't think that that's a very helpful comparison. What I'm worried about, though, and what I think everyone here should be worried about, is growing anti-Western sentiment in Ukraine. So I think that, yes, we're resetting things. We have Biden and we have Zelensky. We have Biden who's committed to Ukraine, who understands the country. But Zelensky himself is from a very, very different background than previous presidents. He's from Eastern Ukraine. He's a Russian speaker. There's nothing wrong with that. But he doesn't have very much exposure to the West. If you turn on the TV on Zeke, which is a really popular channel, there's a hit job that's saying that Soros is responsible for everything. There's growing anti-Western sentiment. We know that Zelensky is arrogant. We know that he doesn't like the advice of international financial institutions. And Kolomoisky is really pushing this narrative. So that's something that I'm watching. The relationship of Ukraine and the United States is tense because of the Trump administration. And it's going to take a lot to repair it. I think that we're engaging in magical thinking, unicorns and fairy dust, if we think that by Biden coming in, everything's going to be great. It's not. It's going to take a huge amount of work to repair the relationship and for the Ukrainians to trust us again. That's what I'm worried about.
So, but you're also, what you mentioned, President Zelensky. So, what are the prospects of him turning Ukraine away from the West? Are you concerned about that?
I don't think Zelensky's a real reformer. I don't think there's very much evidence that supports that. When he was elected last year, there was a huge amount of optimism in the West, and he talked a really good game. He made 3 big pledges. He said, "I'm going to get rid of corruption. I'm going to make Ukraine rich, and I'm going to end the war." Now, those are really hard goals. Those are things you cannot do overnight, and you can't do them in a year. He hasn't made very much progress, and he's made 0 progress on corruption. The corruption fight has actually backtracked on his watch, and he dismissed a reformist government in March for no good reason.
Well, you mentioned that, but maybe you could clarify in your opinion, what would a Biden policy, Ukraine policy look like? I mean, you mentioned corruption, that the Biden administration is going to be committed to fight against corruption, but how is it going to do that? What would be the instruments?
Tough love. It's tough love. We have to speak out forcefully when they fall short. Yes, we need to keep up our military assistance. We need to keep sending javelins. There's a lot of vulnerability. Yulia's right, in the Black Sea. The Ukrainian Navy needs a lot more assistance. It needs a lot of gear. It needs more boats. And we can do all these things. There's been some studies done on the actual needs down there. We can meet those needs, and we should meet those needs. I'm not a specialist on military equipment, and I'm not going to pretend to be. There are very smart people. Mike Carpenter is one of them, who understand what the Ukrainians need. Let's make it happen. Let's get rid of the bureaucratic tape and meet their needs. But honestly, Ukraine needs it needs a friend who calls it on the carpet and demands that they reform. Everyone knows what Ukraine needs to do. And the tragedy of Ukrainian politics is that no one does it. They have to do real judicial reform. Petro Poroshenko didn't do it. He lied about it. He said he was doing it. And then he made fun of the high anti-corruption court. And then he finally had to do it. Zelensky pretended to do judicial reform last year, and it didn't work. If you talk to investors, they know it's a sham. They want real courts. Let's do it.
Well, Yulia, Romania is also a right-leaning country, right? So how is, again, Trump and Trumpism viewed there?
Yes, that's a complicated question, and I can't go into a lot of details because we have a limited time. But I would advise, if anyone is interested, particularly in that, to read the report, the part on Romania. I would say that I would agree with Dimitar. Actually, Dimitar and I did a study a few years ago looking at the vulnerability of Black Sea countries to disinformation and to this tailored Russian disinformation that in countries like Romania, who is traditionally Russophobic, everybody fears the Russians, everybody sees the Russian threat. The narrative that is working with Russian disinformation is that it's undermining the West and undermining Western solidarity and questioning the West's willingness to accept Romania, which doesn't feel yet accepted in the Euro-Atlantic community as it should be. And that, of course, feeds in Romania and in many Black Sea countries, which are rather patriarchal, rather conservative, the narrative that is coincidentally, to a certain extent, overlapping from the Russian side and also from, ironically, the Trump administration in questioning Western values and feeding into conservative values, that has affected Romania. And you see that in terms of opinion polls and support for one or the other. And you also see that, as Dimitar mentioned, in Bulgaria, maybe to a lesser extent in Romania, in terms of how the media portrays events in the United States, not just US elections, but for instance, the movements around Black Lives Matter were being portrayed in mass media in Romania, partially pretty impartial, pretty much on the right side. So this is definitely concerning. But then on the other hand, in countries like Romania, we see a bit of an artificial separation between foreign policy elites and public opinion. And foreign policy elites in Romania have had sort of the advantage that in the unique case of a bipartisan consensus of Western integration. Unlike in Bulgaria or in other cases in the Black Sea, Romania at the beginning of the 90s consensually, bipartisanly across said we need to go towards the West, and this has not really been questioned. So the influence of traditional values, of Trumpism, of Russian disinformation, in that extent has been rather limited, I would say. So again, it goes back to how different countries in the Black Sea perceive the elections, perceive the republicanism versus democratism, if you can call it that, in the United States. And also something that makes it a bit more complicated, but should be highlighted, and you see that throughout our report, is that the way US elections have been perceived across the Black Sea has very much depended on the fact that Black Sea elections are going on. Romania has elections in December that will determine a lot on how the country goes into Western integration. Bulgaria has had protests over the last few months. We have elections this weekend in Moldova. We had
There's an election in Bulgaria in March as well.
yeah. So all of this, including in Dimitar's piece and in others in the report, show that U.S. elections often have been perceived as hand in hand or in a complicated relationship with local elections going on. And I think the dice have not been thrown yet on what the complex environment of foreign policy orientations in the Black Sea will look like in a Biden administration with partially new administrations in the Black Sea, including Romania.
Can I jump in just to say something
sure.
interesting? Going back to, I mean, in the Bulgarian case, what is interesting about Trumpism is that it transcended political divides. In the 90s, it was easy. You're pro-Western, you vote for the center-right. You're left-leaning, you vote for the post-communists. Now, post-communists are saying, well, Trump is great because he didn't start any wars and he's friends with Putin. And the right is saying, look, Biden is a socialist, kind of echoing the messaging coming from the conservatives in the US. So Trump seems to be bridging the divide, not polarizing Bulgarian political opinion, which is fascinating to me.
Well, Yulia, what about Georgia and Moldova? How Trump is viewed there?
Well, I mean, it's different from one country to another. Georgia, I would say, goes very much on the same path as Romania, though not NATO member state, relies heavily on US security guarantees, is heavily, even now, more so with Nagorno-Karabakh, concerned about security, regional security, and the future of its internal stability as it's being affected by insecurity around it. So for the Georgian leadership, much like the Romanian leadership, Trump or Biden is fine as long as they stay committed to Black Sea security. And I think with Black Sea security is being meant both dimensions. So on one side, the military part, here going back to Romania very quickly and saying Romania's main concern is military, the militarization of the Black Sea in Crimea by Ukraine, which is threatening NATO territory, and where NATO and the West have not stepped in sufficiently to actually deter Russia. But back to Georgia, some of their hopes for the new administration, as Trump has stepped in, or Pompeo on the western side of the Black Sea with the deals that I mentioned earlier, is for the United States to actively contribute to critical infrastructure development and general development of Georgia as it's kind of the key transit from Caspian Sea and Central Asia into Europe. So that's something that Georgia is hoping for, particularly, especially now in the last few days of the Trump administration and obviously going into the Biden administration. For Moldova, things are, I would say, particularly complicated because Moldova has had a history of learning, the small country of Moldova, to balance Eastern and Western interests and kind of weigh into both of them, play nice with both of them, so they get out of it what is possible, with heavy corruption on the ground and with a current campaign, electoral campaign that is classically the division between East and West. You have the incumbent president Dodon, who is a friend of Putin, who in the past, until it has become illegal in electoral campaigns, has posted pictures with him and Putin, and then with Patriarch Kirill when Putin was not possible anymore. So his leaning is clearly towards the East, whereas his competition, Maia Sandu, is clearly the Western favorite. Moldova has had, particularly in the EU, a general US a Western perspective, some years of being the model child of Eastern Partnership, everything going really well, fight against corruption, judicial reform, until the theft of the century, when a third of the GDP disappeared. And since then, because that took place under a Western orientation government, the Moldovan population has been even more divided across East and West. So the election outcomes in the next over the next weekend between Maya and Maya Sandu and Igor Dodon will tell us very much about where Moldova will be heading in relationship with the United States and the West generally over the last 4 years. In just one sentence, if Maya Sandu wins, Western integration and heavy fight against corruption, which Biden's administration is going to love, is going to be priority number one. With Igor Dodon continuing to be president, it's going to be the opposite.
Melinda, there's a question for you from the audience, and the question is it too late for a deal on Ukraine, where Russia gives back Crimea in return for a 100-year lease on the naval base?
I don't think it's politically feasible in Kiev. I don't think they would be willing to accept that under any circumstances.
Okay, so maybe we have about 10-15 minutes. And this is a question to all of you guys, not just Yulia, but how can the US work with these regional countries that you are covering to improve regional security? What are some of the concrete steps that the US can take?
I think the biggest thing that the Biden administration needs to do is figure out a way to convince the Black Sea countries that they want to be part of the EU and NATO, right? That after 2008, there's still a big question. Georgia and Ukraine were promised eventual membership. They were given these weird wishy-washy guarantees in 2008. We failed there. We need to figure out how we can incentivize these countries in transition to do the right thing and join the Western clubs. And no one knows the answer to that. And obviously the EU is not in very good shape, and NATO also needs to reboot as well.
Yulia?
Sure. Let me just super quickly run through countries, 3 countries, sorry. I think the expectation, the thing that Biden can do is to create, in one sentence, a coherent policy for the Black Sea, which has been missing. That the Biden administration, I know it's a long shot, but actually prioritizes Black Sea security. And with that,
let me just interrupt you there. Sorry, Yulia, but is it possible to have a Black Sea policy when all these Black Sea countries, as we've seen with this panel, when they have different priorities, diverging policies? How can the US craft a Black Sea policy when that's the case?
I think one of the ways to go about it is to think in terms of, however negatively that term is being used sometimes, coalitions of the willing. Because we have an incoherent threat assessment of Russia in the region, but some countries align strongly with the United States on that, it is up to the United States, one thing, to support their regional cooperation in creating regional security that is flexible and that is not strictly in the NATO EU frameworks and out of the frameworks, which has been so far clearly dividing artificially and against the will of Black Sea people, the region into East and West. To think out of the box in terms of more flexible regional engagements in which countries like Turkey, like Bulgaria, NATO member states that are more reluctant for different reasons, have options to opt in or opt out. This is something that can be done, and I think particularly with the Biden administration. I had no hopes for that for the Trump administration, but Biden being such a transatlantic president, and with so many hopes from Western Europe that he will be more engaged and create a strategic EU-US partnership, the EU has been completely missing, particularly on the security dimension in the Black Sea. So what Biden can actually do is to rally Western support and increase Western European presence in the Black Sea, as we've seen in the Baltic Sea. To the Baltic Sea, Western Europe has been far more committed because they had a coherent threat perception. But if we think outside of the box in terms of regional flexible formats of cooperation, military exercises, shared capabilities for monitoring, for radar, nothing offensive, but to actually deter a little bit militarization, increased militarization of the Black Sea, which is a concern for all of NATO and the Western world, and actually brought Biden to pursue Western European presence with troops on the ground, with more engagement, with more financial support from France, from Germany, from the UK, this would actually really make a difference to Black Sea security, I think.
What about, sorry, before turning to you, Dimitar, there is a question which is relevant to what we're discussing right now. Can economic assistance play a role here? So the question is, for example, Ukraine has been a major wheat producer historically, and there's much agricultural production and food processing potential in Armenia, Georgia, Ukraine. So can economic aid play a role there? Okay, anyone?
I'm sorry, there's something missing to the question. Play a role in what? In its transformation?
No, in US's efforts to ensure to craft a Black Sea policy and ensure that the security is secured in the region.
Sure, but I don't think that's the most important part. The security, the hard security is the important part. I think there's a bigger question, though, that we haven't answered. Why should the U.S. prioritize the Black Sea region? I mean, it's not an easy, and I'm not trying to be the skunk at the garden party. It's an important question to answer. Like, there's a lot of other priorities now. There's a lot of hotspots, and this is a pretty obscure region. Why should Biden care?
Yeah, it would be great if you could answer that. I was trying to get at that at the very beginning when I directed that question to Yulia. But yeah, maybe very briefly, and we have a few minutes, and I want to ask one more question. But there are a few questions from the audience. So yes, Melinda, would you like to answer that question?
I'll give it a try.
Okay, go ahead.
You know, from both for the Black Sea, European disengagement, Western disengagement has been a big disappointment, right? Because it's still part of Europe, but even if it's in Europe's backyard, and it's such an important region that connects Europe with the Middle East and with Asia, it's been neglected. And of course, Melinda's question is super relevant. But if we go back to the principles before 2008 that have been abandoned because of Russian aggression, a country that has the size of the GDP compared to Spain or to Italy, they've managed to do a lot of damage, including in affecting the Western interests and values of Europe whole and free. And we've seen over a decade, basically since 2008, a continuous disengagement. And of course, we have other regions that are just as volatile in security. But for the people, the Ukrainian people, the Georgian people that are being left with, they wanted to integrate. There was a lukewarm response in 2008, and then they got major territorial losses, war and invasion, and are now with the option of they don't have the option of integrating into the West because of Russia, and they've had major losses. That's something that I think we owe, if we look at the West, to look deeper into that. And just very quickly on the economic development, I agree with Melinda that it's not a priority, not the #1 priority, but I would argue that it's the #2 priority, because the kind of a spiral that the Black Sea has been going through is that at the end of the 1989, 1991, when these countries gained independence, the Soviet Union had already drained economies, drained industry, and further affected then Russia critical infrastructure. So without economic development and Western buy-in into the region, these small countries don't have a lot of options, either then to orientate towards themselves towards the East, and that's not something they want. So giving them some options of development with more buy-in from the West, whether it's the leadership of the United States or through the Eastern Partnership, a refurbished Eastern Partnership of the EU, is something that will make in the medium and long term a huge difference in creating also security on the ground. Unmute, Gunnar. Sorry, we couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Dimitar, any final, before that, let me turn to Dimitar, but this is a question for you, Yulia. What is the reason for Pompeo's visit to Georgia? But let me turn to Dimitar to see what are your thoughts on what the next US administration can do to promote the security of the Black Sea.
I want to go back to something Melinda said about corruption. I mean, Bulgaria has been locked in this struggle for a long time. And one of the realizations, one of the lessons is that it cannot be fixed from the outside, be it the European Commission or the US. It's in the hands of the locals. And that's fair enough. But still, having a friendly voice or supportive voice from Washington carries a lot of weight, whether it's the ambassador, State Department, or Biden himself. So the more you pressure on those issues of governance, cleaner government, the more results you get, because all other underlying issues are somehow related. I mean, if Russia doesn't have all those enabling factors to impact on the economic elites, on the media sphere, and so on and so forth, it wouldn't be as influential through the domestic political route. So that's really, really important. I mean, for the Bulgarians, one thing worth mentioning as well is that Biden will be much more involved in the Western Balkans, which is part of Bulgaria's neighborhood, as we now see the Macedonian issue. And his engagement will be much more conventional. We won't have Rick Grenell going around and promising deals to all kinds of shady characters in the region and undercutting the EU. There will be a much more coherent, hopefully transatlantic approach, and that makes a difference. On security, yes, more French, also German and Italian as well. I mean, Italy is a big power in our neighborhood, although we try to forget about it. The more of Western Europeans we see in, for example, NATO rotation in the Black Sea, the better it is. And also Bulgaria has been dragging its feet on military modernization. Only lately there's some movement, and it's a complex issue. We need a separate session why Eastern allies are lagging behind. It has governance component as well. But the more reassurance and the more assistance from the US you have, and also pressure on government to overhaul the security sector, the better. And by security sector, it's not just the military, but also the whole shebang, including intelligence and security services, which also goes to foreign malign influence. But let's finish on this thought. It won't be just Russia, and it's not enough to hammer it out again and again. China is going to be looming large, and the next administration is likely to be as hawkish as this one. That's my expectation. What we saw with these memorandums on 5G signed with a number of countries, lately Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Kosovo, also Romania, Poland. There'll be more coming, and there'll be resistance, I guess. So this is the one to watch and maybe have our next session looking at.
Yeah, and one more, I know I asked you a question about Georgia, Yulia, but one more question I want to squeeze that in. If the question is, if the United States pivots away from from the region towards Asia, which European countries are likely to fill the gap?
In the Black Sea?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe Turkey. Maybe you can tell us more about Turkey filling the gap. Black Sea countries, again, a complicated relationship, but Black Sea member states, particularly Romania, and then US allies, particularly Georgia, have been looking actually towards Turkey with a lot of hope, because Turkey, with the complicated relationship that it has with Russia and with the United States, is the only country that can actually deter to a certain extent, particularly militarily, Russia's militarization in the Black Sea. And it's a huge economy that countries like Georgia and Romania will want to work, or are wanting to work more with. I won't weigh in on Bulgaria, Turkey, because that's Dimitar's domain. And then very quickly on because last thing about who can fill the vacuum, the power vacuum in the region, there's not many. If you look at potential Western powers that could be present, they're just absent: UK, Germany, France. And then on the question of why Pompeo is going to Georgia next week, well, it's complicated again, but I would say so. The tour is part of 7 stops with Paris, Istanbul, not Ankara, and then Tbilisi, and then off to the Gulf and Israel. But Georgia stands out as a visit indeed. We're going to have an article about that coming soon, and also a discussion next week with ambassadors on elections in the region, and the Georgian ambassador will be part of that visit of Pompeo. But I would say there's 2 reasons. One is Georgia needs to be urgently reassured. It's a 3-point-something million country, democracy, the only stable democracy in the South Caucasus right now, and it's increasingly surrounded by insecurity and also by Russian presence. And then going back to what I mentioned initially, Pompeo's Black Sea great power competition with China, I am supposing that this is his last visit, of course, to Georgia. So he will want to into the region. So he will at least want to, I don't know if he will achieve a grand finale with another economic deal that the Trump administration can display as an achievement in countering Russia and China, and also furthering economic development and particularly energy security in the region. So I'm thinking this is what the last few days of the Trump administration will be in the Black Sea.
Well, there are a few more questions, but I have to end it there. I want to thank you all for your contributions. This has been an amazing discussion, and thanks to those who have been following this. See you next time.